This is the final lecture for environmental science, and in this lecture we will talk about waste management. We'll talk about different waste disposal methods as well as ways to reduce waste and manage hazardous waste. Our case study is the Freshkills landfill, which was the largest landfill in the world. It permanently closed in 2001. The last amount of waste was actually rubble from the World Trade Center attacks on September 11th. It has since been closed, capped, and will be turned into some form of recreation center by the city of New York. Some important terms to keep in mind. Waste is pretty much anything we don't want anymore. Anything that is produced by human activity that we don't want anymore and need to get rid of. Municipal solid waste specifically refers to non-liquid waste that comes from homes and small businesses. So this is the trash you drag out to the curb every week. Industrial solid waste is waste from any type of production of consumer goods or any type of other commercial business, whether it's mining, agriculture, or petroleum extraction and refining. Hazardous waste is waste that is either solid or liquid that it has one or more of these four properties. It could be toxic, reactive, flammable, or corrosive. And wastewater is water from households or businesses, as well as polluted runoff. And we're not going to focus on wastewater in this unit. We're going to focus on municipal solid waste, or MSW, industrial waste, and hazardous waste. Waste management consists of basically three components: recycling and recovering, minimizing the generation of waste or source reduction, and finally disposal of the waste. Municipal solid waste, also known as trash or garbage, is a big problem in every country, in particular the US. We generate a lot of trash, and many people have criticized the US lifestyle, calling it a throwaway society because of the use of excessive packaging and other disposable or non-durable goods. It generates large amounts of waste stream. In the US, the average American generates almost 5 pounds of trash each day, more than any other nation. And you can see from this pie chart, the type of material generated in the waste consists of a number of different types of material, paper being the largest single component. Waste generation is rising in all nations, and disposing of it is a problem both in developed nations and in developing nations. In many developing nations, poor people often scavenge the waste dumps in their communities to get things that they could sell or use in their home. Tragically, in one dump in the Philippines, a pile of waste collapsed and actually suffocated several people, resulting in ultimately the government closing that dump from anybody scavenging in it anymore because of the tragedy. Recycling, composting, reduction, and reuse are rising in most developed nations, thereby reducing the pressure on landfill. And landfills are the most common ways that waste is disposed of. What is often referred to as a sanitary landfill is a landfill where waste is piled into big mounds. These are regulated by state and local governments, as well as the federal government under what's known as the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, which requires that all such landfills be permitted and regulated. While the waste is in the landfill, it begins to decompose, and oftentimes as water seeps through, water will pick up various contaminants from the waste, resulting in contaminated water, often referred to as leachate. It needs to be collected in order to prevent it from contaminating the groundwater. And here we have a schematic, a cross-sectional diagram of a typical landfill. Typical landfill would be situated first well above the water table. So this isn't exactly to scale. You'd want to keep it well above the water table to minimize contamination. And then you've got various layers here, layers of gravel and plastic and clay that are designed to prevent as much water as you can from seeping out of the landfill and into the ground water. And then you have a series of pipes that collect the leachate, which then can be collected and treated to remove the contaminants, again, to prevent contamination of the groundwater. And you can see also we have a groundwater monitoring well here, which is drawing up samples of the groundwater to test it and to make sure that no contaminants are getting into the groundwater source. You also notice everything is based on these individual cells, these little blocks of waste. Each day's waste is piled up and then covered with soil to prevent the attraction of pests like rodents or seagulls from getting into the trash. So at the end of the day, they cover it with soil to keep, again, pests from getting into it and allow the trash to eventually decompose. As it decomposes, often methane gas is a waste product. So here we have methane gas being recovered and actually used as an energy source here. That's very important because you don't want the methane to seep through the soil and end up in people's homes. You want to collect it and make use of it as an energy source rather than endangering the public. Once a landfill has reached the end of its operating life and is filled up, it's capped, and oftentimes it's converted to other uses. They build housing developments, city parks like this one in San Francisco, on top of old landfills. Drawbacks to landfills, well, first of all, no matter how well they engineer the linings, the plastic, the clay, everything else, nothing is perfect. Eventually, some of the leachate will escape, especially if the leachate collection system hasn't been maintained. Finding a suitable location is often very tough. They call this the NIMBY syndrome, not in my backyard. People don't want the trash in their backyard. They want it taken far, far away from their community where they never have to see it again. So nobody wants to find out a landfill is going near their community. So often when a new landfill is proposed, it receives stiff resistance from local residents. Another method of dealing with waste is incinerating it, which is burning the trash at very high temperature. This will greatly reduce both the volume and mass of the waste generated. However, it doesn't completely eliminate it. You still have about 10% of the original mass left over in the form of ash that will have to be sent to a landfill. So while incinerators don't eliminate the need for landfills, they can greatly extend the lifespan of landfills and reduce the need for more landfills simply by reducing the amount of space needed. The ash is one waste product. Another waste product are often air pollutants that must be captured by scrubbers and other air pollution technologies to remove hazardous components from the emissions. And here we have a schematic of a typical solid waste incinerator. First, the truck backs up on what's known as the tipping floor. It's called that because, well, they tip the truck open and dump the waste into the storage pit. Is then picked up by the crane and through a series of conveyor belts. It's then delivered to the furnace where it is burned, and then the emissions are captured by the scrubber in the bag house, and the ash is collected at the bottom. So we have two types of ash, the fly ash captured from the emissions and the bottom ash. These both end up in a landfill. Now, this solid waste incinerator is also being used to generate electricity by boiling water and running a turbo generator. And for this reason, many incinerators are often referred to as waste-to-energy facilities. But they are expensive to operate, and it may take years for an incinerator to become profitable. As many people here in South Central Pennsylvania know, one of the reasons why the city of Harrisburg is experiencing such severe economic problems is because of the large amounts of debt that the city's incinerator has built up. They have spent many decades with problems upgrading the emissions control system for the power plant, updating the emissions control systems for the incinerator, and high operating costs and very little revenue coming in has caused the city to rack up huge amounts of debt. So it can take a while. It can take long term or maybe even never for a waste to energy facility to actually make back the initial investment. As I mentioned also, The gases that are produced by the decomposition of waste inside a landfill can also be used as a source of energy. It's mostly methane, so that can then be used as a source of energy, just like natural gas. A better option than disposal is source reduction, reducing or preventing the generation of waste in the first place. This eliminates all the cost of disposal and recycling and minimizes pollution and other problems associated with the generation of the waste to begin with. You can reduce waste at the manufacturer level. One way is to choose minimally packaged goods, buying things in bulk. You can see over the years, many products have become packaged in smaller and smaller containers. Prime example, things like software. The boxes that are used to ship software are becoming smaller, less space is needed for things like instruction manuals. Those are being reduced in size, and most of the instructions are now often on the CD-ROM itself in the form of a PDF or other help document. Other things like CDs. If you bought music CDs in the 1980s, they were sold in cardboard boxes that were almost 2 feet long. And even though the jewel case itself is very small, the reason why the boxes were so long was purely an anti-theft measure, because the larger box was harder to sneak out under your coat or in your purse or whatever. So CD stores, music stores switched to more electronic tags to reduce theft as opposed to these larger packages. So now the cases are now simply shrink wrapped in plastic wrap instead of put in these larger boxes. Other products like deodorant and other consumer goods, they've seen significant reduction in their packaging. So those are some examples. Question, of course, often that you face in the grocery store is paper or plastic. Many people promote paper bags because they are biodegradable and will decompose, unlike plastic bags, which do not in any foreseeable future. They can take centuries to break down, and so are a big source of litter and danger to wildlife. So some communities have actually taken to eliminate plastic bags altogether, are encouraging people to switch to paper or cloth bags that are reusable. Reusing is another way to reduce waste. Buy stuff in bulk, bring your own cup to coffee shops. Many coffee shops actually will give you a discount if you do that way. Double-sided photocopies. Taking your old inkjet cartridges to a store that will recycle them. Composting kitchen and yard wastes are all ways that you can reuse stuff. Composting is a way of recovering organic waste, including kitchen and yard waste, using bacteria or other critters in the soil to break down it and convert it to a compost that can be used as a fertilizer in your garden or other lawn treatment. These, again, will reduce waste and have a benefit to the soil as well. Then there's recycling, which is taking used goods and reprocessing them into new items. Step one is bringing them to what are known as material recovery facilities, or MRFs, where the material are sorted, cleaned, shredded, and then reprocessed. Now, decades ago, MRFs used to depend on people actually bringing their recyclable materials to them. And they had very low participation in this process because it was a bother. Nobody wanted to save up their newspapers for weeks and then truck them all out on a Saturday morning to the MRF. So instead, starting in the 1980s, communities began collecting for free recyclables. And today, in most municipalities in Pennsylvania, you're often given a recycling bin or barrel from your local government, where you can put plastic and cans and other recyclable materials in there to be collected. And by having curbside pickup of recyclables, you get a much larger participation among residents because you make it easier for them. Step two, process them into new products. And step three then is bring them to market where people will buy them. And that's one of the keys. If there's no market for recycled goods, then no matter how well designed a recycling program is, it ultimately won't work. But recycling has grown tremendously, especially since the 1980s, to the point where these days A number of things are recycled in large amounts, 99% of auto batteries, for example. Other things are not recycled in the same amounts. Another way to address waste is taking the pay-as-you-throw approach. One local municipality that I'm aware of, and it's the Borough of Carlisle, requires residents to put trash in special bags that you have to buy from the borough, and then they'll pick up the recyclables in a separate container for free, but they charge you based on how much waste you generate. The more waste you generate, the more bags you have to buy from the municipality. So everyone pays for their trash amount they generate rather than a flat monthly or quarterly rate. So the less you waste, the less you pay. It's to encourage people to generate less waste that way. Plastic recycling has a number of things that have to be dealt with. One is the fact that plastic is not one single material. It's actually a group of different materials, and each plastic is given a particular number. For example, high-density polyethylene, or HDPE, is assigned the number 2. Any recyclable plastic container will have one of these numbers stamped in it somewhere, and this is to identify it at the MRF so that they can sort that. You cannot mix two types of plastic together when you recycle them. Do that, the plastic won't hold together, they don't mix, and they won't form a viable product. So you have to separate the peat from the HDPE, and so on, as you recycle, because you don't want to mix these together. Tires are another thing that are often recycled. Funny thing about tires, you can't landfill. Tires are so buoyant that rainwater eventually lifts them out of the ground. They will literally pop out of the soil if you try to bury them. So they have to be shredded or incinerated or recycled into other materials. Tires are often recycled into playground material or other types of ground cover used in parks. Facility. Paper is another widely recycled material. There are two types of paper recycling. There is what is known as pre-consumer paper, paper that was recycled from the leavings during the manufacturing process. And this never left the paper mill, so it just gets gathered up at the one end of the manufacturing process and then taken back and pulped up again to be used in the next batch of paper. And then there's post-consumer paper. This is paper that, for example, was used to print newspapers or office paper, and then after it was used, it was then sent to a recycling center and reprocessed into new paper. Now, if you look at anything that advertises itself as recycled paper, you'll often see in the fine print how much is pre and how much is post-consumer paper content. And this is very important because having a high pre-consumer content is not really doing much to reduce the burden on landfill. If you want to reduce the amount of waste that actually ends up in landfills, you want to buy products that are made of as high a post-consumer paper content as you can find. Now, industrial waste is waste from factories, mining, agriculture, and other industrial processes. Many of the strategies for disposing, recycling, and reducing are similar to municipal waste, but local businesses have to often contend with some unique forms of waste that aren't generated in people's homes. One way is to take an approach where you treat the industrial process as an ecological process. In ecology, what is generated as a waste in one process becomes an important resource by another organism. So in this case here, we have a process, originally was a beer brewery, and they had a problem. They generated wastewater and spent grain as waste products of the brewing of the beer. And they looked at the process and figured out, well, what could we use these waste products for? And eventually they said, well, we can make bread, we can grow mushrooms, we can give it to pigs. These all give us some commercial products like bread, mushrooms, pork, that we can use as other things we could sell. So instead of just spending money to dispose of the waste, we ultimately create more consumer goods and expand our business. So you become less wasteful as a business and you generate more income for yourself instead of viewing waste as a money loser. A special concern of waste are what are known as the hazardous waste. And the EPA defines hazardous waste as some waste product that can meets one of these four criteria. And it could be one, or it could be two or more, it could be all four of these. The first category is ignitable, substances that will catch on fire, such as natural gas or alcohol. Or it could be corrosive. These include strong acids and bases that could corrode metals or even human flesh. The substance could be a reactive, in which case they're chemically unstable. They might explode or produce hazardous fumes under the right conditions. And finally, the material could be toxic, which means they are harmful to human health when people come in contact them, either inhaling, ingesting, or on the skin. So it could be any of these four things, or it could be all four of them. Hazardous waste are generated through a variety of industrial processes, including mining and agriculture and manufacturing, and they can also be generated by homes. Household hazardous waste are often of specific concern because each individual home may generate very small quantities, but added up in toto, these can be a significant source of hazardous waste that need to be dealt with. It can include paints and batteries and cleaning agents and pesticides that are laying around the home that could be materials that are toxic or otherwise harmful to human health or the environment. There are two main categories of hazardous wastes. First one are synthetic organic compounds, and these include pesticides and paints and solvents and all kinds of other pollutants. And many of these are very persistent. They don't readily break down in the environment. Many of them are toxic, and they have particular hazards, including mutagens, carcinogens, teratogens, and endocrine disruptors. The second category are the heavy metal, like lead, chromium, mercury, arsenic, etc. These are widely used in electronics and as well as pigments and dyes and metal plating. And these will bioaccumulate in the tissues of living organisms, and they are all toxic and can damage various organs in the body. In particular, organs like the brain and central nervous system and the liver are vulnerable. E-waste, or electronic waste, is a rising problem. Many electronic devices, including our cell phones and our iPads and our computers and TV screens, contain levels of heavy metals in them that should have them classified as hazardous waste. And this is a particular concern because many of these things, they go obsolete. Apple comes out with a new iPhone just about every year. And of course, everyone's got to buy the new iPhone and get the latest and greatest. So they get obsolete. And even though they may still be working, people still throw them away and can generate hazardous problems in the landfills. Under the RCRA Act, states are required to manage hazardous waste, and large generators of hazardous waste are required to track those waste from cradle to grave. In other words, from the generation of the material to where it is ultimately disposed of in a landfill. And these facilities also are required to have permits under RCRA. One of the things that have to be addressed in regards to hazardous waste are activities that were illegal or harmful. Many companies dumped their waste in illegal dumps or kind of just made it disappear mysteriously, shoving it off to one corner of the world where nobody was looking at the time. And this resulted in many contaminated sites that had to be dealt with. And under federal laws that were passed in the 1970s to curb these practices, companies today can face some pretty stiff fines if they're caught disposing of waste in any manner that is harmful or illegal. One type of problem that was generated in past practices were what are known as orphan sites. This is where a company accumulates large amount of waste. Maybe they were hired to dispose of the waste by other companies, and they stack the drums of waste in some corner, in some open field somewhere where, again, nobody's looking. And then once the area is filled up, the company declares bankruptcy, dissolves itself, disappears, and then leaves all these drums then to rust in the field. Of course, this results in often generating pollutants in the soil and the groundwater as they leak out of the drums and seep into the ground. So to dispose of hazardous wastes, many facilities now have to have waste in hazardous waste landfill. These are much more stringently designed landfills than the sanitary landfills used for municipal solid waste. They often have multiple liners and multiple leachate collection systems. The waste is often encased in concrete in addition to the clay and plastic liners to capture it. And you can see in this example, we have 2 leachate collection systems, 2 monitoring wells sampling the water at different places. All of this is designed, again, to minimize the escape of the waste as much as they can. Another disposal method are what are known as surface impoundments. And these are actually temporary disposal solutions where the water containing hazardous waste is put into a shallow depression and allow the water to evaporate, leaving behind the hazardous residue that then can be sent somewhere else. And of course, one of the problems with these is that the linings of these impoundments can crack and leak, and rainstorms can cause them to overflow, causing them to contaminate the area. And so an improperly managed surfaced impoundment can have numerous problems associated with it if it is not properly maintained. Another method is deep well injection, where you dig and drill a well deep underground and then inject the hazardous waste into a layer of porous rock that is hopefully separated by an impervious layer of soil from the aquifers above it. And the idea, again, is to completely isolate the waste from the groundwater so as not to contaminate any drinking water supplies. However, these wells can corrode, they can crack, they can leak, so oftentimes these wastes can migrate up into the aquifer and contaminate well water. Now, as you can see, especially in cases of orphan sites where the waste was abandoned, or what's often known as midnight dumping, where waste was just dropped off in an abandoned field or an old warehouse and just kind of mysteriously appeared overnight with no paper trail, no information as to where it come from. Basically, the company just said, okay, we'll just throw it here and pretend it's gone now, and that's it. So we had a lot of contaminated sites in this country. And to deal with it, first we passed laws like RCRA, which mandated new standards for disposal methods of these hazardous wastes. And then in 1980, we passed the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA, more commonly known as the Superfund Act. And this act was intended to not regulate new disposal method, but to fix problems from past practice. In other words, is to identify polluted sites and then provide a funding mechanism to clean them up. Often these sites are called brownfields. These are lands where the soil might be contaminated by hazardous materials, which may make their reuse or development problematic. So this was spurred by some pretty high-profile cases like Love Canal in New York, where families had to be evacuated by a contaminated site that was actually leaking into their homes. And the Superfund process works basically like this. When a site is identified that is contaminated and needs cleaning up, the EPA steps in and starts doing an evaluation. And then they do whatever methods are necessary and most expedient to contain the contamination. And then they put it on what's known as the National Priorities List. And once on the National Priorities List, or NPL, contractors are hired to begin the cleanup process. And the NPL ranks them according to what the risk is to local residents, and then they're cleaned up on a site-by-site basis as funds are available. Once the site is cleaned up, there are public hearings. Residents are informed of what the problem is and what they did to clean it up, and the public is given a chance to tell the EPA what a horrible job they did and why everything is still messed up. Eventually, then, the site is declared cleaned up and removed from the NPL. CERCLA is based on what they call the polluter pays principle. If a responsible party can be identified, and that's a pretty broad category, it could be the former owner of a site, it could be the company whose waste was disposed of in the site, and it could be anybody else who was involved in the chain of custody where this waste from cradle to grave, again, from where it was generated to where it ultimately ended up. Anybody in that chain could be considered a responsible party. And if a responsible party is identified, EPA takes them to court and wrangles a settlement out of them to pay for the cleanup. And this is why often CERCLA is often called by many in the industry in a rather tongue-in-cheek manner the Welfare for Lawyers Act. Now, if a responsible party cannot be identified, then the money comes out of a special fund. And originally the fund was paid for by a federal tax on the chemical industry, but that tax was not renewed in recent years. So now to pay for the cleanup, it comes directly out of taxpayer funds from the general federal funds. The average cleanup costs $25 million and takes 12 to 15 years. And that concludes our discussion on waste management.